So yeah, just to say a little bit about where I am and where I'm coming from. I'm a senior editor at the Economist newspaper, which is a magazine, and I'm also someone who wrote a book about solar geoengineering and other forms of geoengineering, including some non-climate geoengineering that was published in 2015, called "The Planet Remade," about which people said kind things. And while most of my books I sort of like write and then I sort of like move on to something else. Something about geoengineering made me stick around, and so I've been part of discussions and public meetings and things on the subject ever since. And I'm also on the board of trustees of the Degrees Initiative, which is a British charity which funds solar geoengineering research in developing countries, not with an eye to advocacy, but with an eye to simultaneously building up capacity in those countries so that those countries can have an informed voice in future debates, and also answering questions about solar geoengineering, which are particular importance to researchers in those countries. So although my day job is as an editor who has no particular links to geoengineering or even increasingly to climate discourse, that's still a large part of how I sort of like self-identify. And so Herb just asked me to say a little bit. And I should also tell you, I'll tell you later about Kurt Vonnegut. But Herb said I should say a little bit about how my thinking might be pertinent to what you're talking about at the moment. And I was recently on a little discussion with Ken Caldera on this subject with another group. And Ken was stressing something which he and others put into a recent sort of like UNEP micro report on solar geoengineering, which is something that I think everyone needs to remember and is still very missing from mainstream climate discourse, which is that solar geoengineering does seem to offer a way of promptly cooling the Earth or slowing the warming of the Earth. And current evidence suggests that there are ways of implementing it which, if pursued, would have very few, if any, real losers. There are various studies by Pete Irvin and colleagues along these lines, and they find that only very small numbers of very small parts of the continental surface are actively worse off under solar geoengineering than under greenhouse warming plus solar geoengineering than they are under greenhouse warming alone. And those are I think those are all, in fact, areas where the impact of greenhouse warming is in itself very low. And so you get a minor detriment to people who aren't at the moment at much risk. But this is sort of like 4 to 8% of the land surface area. So the biogeophysical, biogeochemical situation with respect to solar geoengineering, sort of, what are we now? Almost 20 years on from when Paul Crutzen really reopened the discussion on this subject in 2006 with his provocative paper suggesting that solar geoengineering, stratospheric aerosol injection might be used as a replacement for the aerosols being phased out by sulfate controls in the troposphere. So a paper that I think the importance of which it is impossible, I think, to overstate in this field. People kept thinking that there would be really nasty showstoppers to come as research went on. And in my analysis, and I think that pretty much everyone in the field, those showstoppers really haven't turned up. And that may be, and I think we should take very seriously the possibility that there's a level of groupthink, a lack of red teaming that might lie behind that. But at the moment, if you look at the best available evidence, as well as saying we should have more evidence available, you have to say that biogeochemically, biogeophysically, this does not look like a particularly bad idea, and it looks like something which, in terms of prompt harms from climate change, both to humans and to non-human non-human parts of the ecosystem, could be quite harm preventative. That said, increasingly, and I think this is the tone of my book from 2015, but it's certainly been the tone of my comments since. There is a real sense in which the big issues with solar geoengineering are not the biogeophysical ones, that would be associated with an optimal or wise or beneficent solar geoengineering, climate cooling sort of policy. They are the structural worries, both in terms of collective action and in terms of geopolitical conflict. There is a real issue that if you think that you can cool the planet with solar geoengineering, you will be less keen to take the drastic economic and industrial steps that are associated with reducing emissions. And that's very important, I think, for a group like you who have this estimable notion of the climate triad, is how much those two legs push together and how much they push in different directions. So this is an issue of moral hazard. When I first started thinking about solar geoengineering, it was thought to be a particularly solar geoengineering, particularly pertinent to solar geoengineering. I think since Paris, we've seen really, really clearly that it applies to carbon geoengineering, like carbon dioxide reduction from the atmosphere as well, and possibly more clearly, because the degree to which emissions now and reductions in the future are fungible is actually much clearer than the way, much more obvious than the way that emissions now and solar geoengineering in the future might or might not be trade-offs. The sheer drama of the idea of solar geoengineering puts a sort of like threshold level on it that slightly, I think, mitigates the issue of moral hazard, whereas carbon geoengineering, the moral hazard is absolutely clear and plain, that people say, well, we'll have a bit more emission now and we'll have a bit more reduction later. And so you see, and thus the only ways you have of keeping up ideas about keeping to 2 degrees total warming is to have large amounts of carbon dioxide reduction in the second half of the century. I know that you know this because, again, that is another leg of your triad. I'm not sure whether at the moment, I think solar geoengineering or carbon geoengineering has more of a moral hazard effect on emissions reduction, but I think they both do have such an effect, and it's kind of fruitless to suggest they don't. So any solar geoengineering program has to address that to some way, and to some extent it may be that it has to address that by saying, yes, we do need less fast emissions reduction, either less fast than would be optimal or even less fast than is now going ahead. That's a very difficult problem and very hard discussion to have on a global level. The other thing about geopolitical risk that I'd just say at this early stage in our discussion is that solar geoengineering, as I'm sure many of you know, one of the early reasons for thinking it wouldn't work would be that it doesn't map in an equal and opposite way onto climate forcing by greenhouse gases. Climate forcing by greenhouse gases happens all the time. Solar geoengineering only cools by day. Solar geoengineering has different latitudinal effects to greenhouse gas warming, etc. It turns out that to a possibly surprising degree, most of this comes out in the wash. And I think that's mainly because most of climate is the ocean. And it doesn't really care whether it's morning or whether it's daylight or not. Everything everything comes out in the wash once you get to the fact that ocean heating is the big thing. But it's absolutely the case that when you come to geopolitics, the match between solar geoengineering, and I'm thinking prototypically here of stratospheric aerosol injection, the match between that and greenhouse gas warming in terms of politics is actually very poor. They look actually almost the opposite of each other politically, in that and we could debate how reasonable this is, but in greenhouse gas warming greenhouse gas emissions reduction, the worry is always one of free riders who will get the benefits of other people reducing without reducing themselves. As Marty Weitzman and Gernot Wagner, who I think has talked in this group before, have pointed out, for solar geoengineering, you have a free driver problem, which is that because it's a relatively cheap thing to undertake, or appears to be, certainly at the front end, if you don't properly account for long-term costs, the person who gets the amount of geoengineering you get is the amount that the person who wants geoengineering the most is willing to put up. Or more specifically, so if you imagine I put up a watt per square meter of sulfates in the atmosphere, if someone else wants 2 watts per square meter, they just have to add to what I'm doing. And if I stop doing what I'm doing, they just have to increase their amount to provide the full 2 watts themselves. There's no way through solar geoengineering that I can counter that. What I could do might be, well, in some, I think, rather far-fetched scenarios, I might counter geoengineer by introducing short-lived high-potency greenhouse gases, or I might just sort of like shoot down their planes or do something like that. So there is this problem if you imagine the dynamics of a solar geoengineered world, there is a lot rests on the amount of solar geoengineering that the non-geoengineering powers are willing to acquiesce to. That's almost takes as read one of the other differences, which is you need to get a lot of the world's most powerful countries to agree in order to make a big change to greenhouse gas emissions. You can make a big change to stratospheric aerosols with a relatively small number of parties, though I think in practical terms you would be well advised to have at least the tacit approval of at least one major power. And the third thing that makes it very different from greenhouse gas warming is the point that Ken makes, and the thing that always makes this a subject worth coming back to, which is it can have prompt effects. Greenhouse gas reduction will not have prompt effects. Emissions reduction will not have prompt effects. And carbon dioxide reduction from the atmosphere, carbon dioxide removal from the atmosphere, will not have very prompt effects. Solar geoengineering can have effects in time spans on the order of years. And so in terms of its suddenness, in terms of its unilateral potential, and in terms of the fact that it's additive, there are huge differences between solar geoengineering and other forms of climate change, because we must be frank about it. Solar geoengineering is a form of climate change. It's climate change in response to, it would be climate change in response to greenhouse gas warming. And it would not be a cessation of climate change. It would be a way of making climate change more complex, but less harmful. But the politics of this sort of climate change are very different from the politics of climate change that we have at the moment. And there might be an argument you could make that since the politics of climate change at the moment are very dysfunctional, that's something that you might almost go so far as to welcome. And I think one should bear in mind the possibility that would be a response. But the idea that if things are really bad now, there is no way to make them worse is not something that recent politics or indeed human history should lead us to discount. So that's more or less where I am, and I'm happy to take part in the discussion from that point on.
Wow, the density of your provocative points is pretty extraordinary, and I know that many of us will be eager to start engaging with you. So I'm rather than asking the first question myself, I'm going to turn it over to Robert Tulip, and the floor is yours, Robert.
Thanks so much,
Hi,
Oliver.
Robert.
That was just awesome. So I'm a part of the steering committee for HPAC. The thing that really perplexed me in this time of cancel culture is that I just feel that our whole geoengineering discourse is just thoroughly cancelled. Like we're just excluded from any mainstream media conversation, with some exception from The Economist, but more broadly, this whole topic just seems to be ignored as a legit, like the way you've just outlined the situation. I think was extremely lucid, but that summary that you've provided, the vast bulk of the population would be completely unaware of the points that you were making, and so I'm really interested in how this debate can get into the op-eds of the New York Times or other major papers.
Well, I mean, we had a climate geoengineering op-ed in the New York Times a couple of months ago. It wasn't necessary. Well, it certainly wasn't to my satisfaction, because it took the line that it was that this was an evil plot against the developing world, when I think any sober analysis of this suggests that the developing world has more to gain from this if it can have a just level of influence over the decisions than most of the rest of the world. It's really odd, isn't it, Robert? Because yeah, I've been thinking for ages that this debate is really about to erupt, and it continuously doesn't, and there have been various reasons I think for that, but the main one is it imposes an extra load on discussions, right? It means that you have to caveat statements like, we can no longer hit 1.5. I mean, I'm not sure it does that, because I'm not sure you can do enough solar geoengineering quickly enough to guarantee 1.5, and I wouldn't be particularly keen on anyone trying. But, you know, what can be done? There's this very tricky word that people use, which is possible, which is really like the word "we." It's a source of an immense number of unexamined assumptions about the world. You know, we should. So people say, well, we should reduce emissions as quickly as possible, and also think about this and not think about that. But no one actually has a sense of what it is that constitutes this possibility. What these sort of like social and economic constraints on the possible are, and I'm sure that they're not widely agreed. So given that, I think it's very hard to introduce another source of caveats, and people, just for reasons of cognitive parsimony, do without it. I mean, there are people who are consciously trying to make sure that solar geoengineering isn't part of the discussion, but I don't think they're particularly influential people. I mean, you know, I think you could go a long way in the corridors of power without actually knowing who Frank Bierman was. But in general, it's just, you know, this isn't what we're talking about, and we want to go on having the conversation that we want to go on having. And at some point, I suppose, I do think that something will crack, but it does, I must admit, it does make me grin when I read in articles, almost every article on geoengineering that does appear in a sort of like general, for a general audience, or in a sort of like policy-facing way, like the Bierman et al. Argument about the moratorium, say that solar geoengineering is increasingly discussed in various circles. And I think, really, is it? I must be no longer getting the invites, because it doesn't feel like it's being increasing. It's just that one of the ways you justify talking about it is not that you want to talk about it, it's that other people are talking about it. And so I think that will eventually, I have to think that will eventually break down, but I can't say I know exactly how to do that. And I'd also, again, on the basis that we should never underestimate the human proclivity for screwing things up, I'm maybe slightly less worried about it than I used to be, but there's a phenomenon that I refer to in my book as the super freak pivot, based on the extremely unsatisfactory discussion of solar geoengineering in Levitt and Dubner's Super Freakonomics, in which they go directly from arguments about maybe global warming isn't actually happening, carbon dioxide isn't very much of the atmosphere, yawn, yawn, to saying that if it is happening, then of course we should do solar geoengineering, and Nathan Myhrvold will show us how to launch blimps full of sulfur into the stratosphere. And that ability to pivot from there's no need for climate action to the only climate action that is needed is solar geoengineering is something that I don't worry about it maybe as much as I did 6 or 7 years ago, but I still think it's a real phenomenon that one should be aware of.
Let me ask Ron if Ron is on our steering circle, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Herb, and thank you, Oliver, for your talk. My questions. I have multiple questions, but one is first of all, HPAC, as you probably know, we're proponents of multiple cooling methods. Call them direct climate cooling methods. Some SRM, some not. Cooling the ocean is among those, etc. So, just one point, and that gets to the second point, which is this kind of global. And I'll get to the question. This global approach, that it's either SRM big, we do 10 years of research and then we do this, global SRM, and we've had David Keith on, talk with us and which we really enjoyed his agreeing to do that. But we find ourselves, I think, in a bit of a debate between waiting for 10 years for more research, and I think that's all these letters saying, we should do more research. So there have been, there has been progress, I think, in that regard. Or the alternative proposal is kind of gradual, maybe subpolar SAI with testing to confirm, to get some data and not just rely on these big models. And just kind of, gradually see, scale it up gradually. And I agree with, from what I've looked at, I don't see any extreme geophysical issues right away, but, you never know. And of course, then it would, hopefully, and in the polar regions would fall out more quickly. You wouldn't have to wait 2 years if there was some kind of adverse impact. But the question, is, with David Keith was, well, maybe, and I think he said the quiet stuff out loud, really. He said, maybe 1.5 and 2.0 are not the correct targets. Maybe that's not such an issue if we go beyond that, because we were saying, well, we're in the peak now. It's not shaved. The problems are happening right now. I'm in Chicago. We've had bad air for 2 days now, the worst air we've ever had. This is serious stuff. And we need cooling right away, and so and SAI is something we should really start talking about pilot testing and implementing right away, and not wait for 10 years to do research and wait until we can be somehow get the 95% confidence or whatever. It just doesn't make sense when, in my view, when you look at the risks of not cooling. And apply all the other methods as well. We don't have to just do SAI. We can do all kinds of things to try and cool right now. So anyway, that's my I'm sorry. It's okay. kind of a speech and a question.
Two thoughts on that. One is that I'm not real crazy about thousand flowers blooming approaches to this, because I think the more forms of climate change you're imposing on the system, the more likely you are to get strange nonlinear complexities. I think one of the things I like about SAI is that it does happen at a sort of like global level. You're not relying, as in some of the early marine cloud brightening.
Excuse me, could someone shut off
their
mic?
So I'm not crazy on sort of like lots and lots and lots of different. It works for carbon dioxide removal, I think that's absolutely fine, because the carbon dioxide really is effectively fungible, especially at the fluxes that you're talking about with any realistic carbon dioxide removal program. But at sunlight reflection and ocean cooling, I'm a little bit worried about synergies. But going back to your we should do it sooner, there is this sort of like perennial problem of who's your we. You have to make a we before you can. Sorry, that sounded more toilety than I expected. You have to construct a we before you can use it. I always remember a guy called Matthews, an anthropologist at UCSC, speaking at the Asilomar, talking to me at the Asilomar Geoengineering conference way back when. When was that? 2012, 2011? When he was saying people talk about providing a sort of like thermostat for the Earth, but the difficulty is creating a hand that you trust to turn the thermostat. It's not like there's a pre-existing hand. So when you say we should start working in the subarctic space, I don't know who the we is. I don't know how you start doing that. You certainly can't start messing around in the Arctic as a non-state actor, because there are 3 superpowers who take the area very seriously. You can't go into the Arctic and say specifically and expect it to be unproblematic that your aim is to re-establish pre-1980s levels of sea ice, because there is a large nation in the Arctic which is quite invested in the idea of having an ice-free coast. So it's not the technology is not, I think, the problem. The problem is making a group which can legitimately and convincingly act without being countered in such a way. And I just don't see how I can see how you can build aircraft pretty quickly. I don't see how you construct that group pretty quickly. And sad to say, the fact that it seems necessary, and I fully understand that apparent necessity, doesn't make it any more possible.
Can I follow up, Herb?
Briefly, Ron.
Okay. So Oliver, one proposal that I've raised, and I don't, the International Space Station analogy. So if you had a few countries, say Canada, the U.S., and countries that were open to the idea, start saying we want to save the Arctic. And and you try and build trust that way. You say, okay, just like the space station, anybody who wants to can contribute. Everything will be transparent. We're doing this for the good of saving the Arctic, and by the way, the Antarctic has got to be, symmetrical to if you're actually going to do significant cooling. But initially, just testing, and working on it that way. And I think, and that relates to your earlier remarks that again, you don't need this for this kind of intervention. You don't really need a global governance, 197 nations agreeing or whatever, is in the IPCC.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely.
A group of people that take the initiative and the other nations be willing to let them, okay, well, we're glad to be free riders, if it helps the Arctic. Right now, Russia probably would not participate, although they participate in the space station. But that's the kind of mechanism that I'm thinking might be a way to go here.
I think I see your point. The issue I do have there is I think Russia might well go beyond not wanting to take part in it. I am not sure that they would want it to happen. And the other thing is, I'm a little bit disturbed by a stress on the Arctic, because very, very few people live there. And to me, so I can see how that works out in a way that says, well, why don't you care about the tropics? Why are you so fixated on the empty Arctic? And I know that there are a lot of First Nations and some settler people in the Arctic, in the high Arctic, but by and large, most of the people doing most of the suffering for climate warming are in the tropics. And I would think a tropical approach would be a more morally defensible early approach, but it would have even more political problems. You have to, I don't think there's any desirable way forward that doesn't involve a certain amount of governance development, especially certainly within a sort of like minilateral to multilateral sort of framework, not in a global framework. That's not going to happen. That said, I think it's quite likely that the first uses of solar geoengineering will be unilateral, ill thought through, quite possibly ineffective, and quite plausibly based on intentions that aren't primarily climate focused. Just like, you know, a lot of wars are started not actually to win territory or anything like that, but because of domestic conditions, other such things. I think we do, and I think David would probably agree with me, but he and I suppose I would then go on and keep doing it absolutely the same, would be we overestimate the likelihood or the relevance of an idealized solar geoengineering pathway, because the one that we get, if we get one at all, will not be an idealized one.
Okay. I'm going to ask Rocio, and then Robert Chris, and then Rebecca, and then Robert Tulip, unless someone who hasn't spoke raises their hand. So go ahead. You may need to unmute
I think
yourself.
you may be muted. You are.
Sorry about that. Yes. Hi, I'm Rocio Herbert. I didn't hear you mention methane removal, and I'm wondering, what do you think the methane removal from the atmosphere, what role would it play in this whole drama, since it actually does have a prompt reaction to cooling the atmosphere?
I think I haven't followed the methane removal debate very closely. I think that methane emissions, certainly given that they seem to have a certain sort of like power law characteristic, are to some extent low-hanging fruit. I think that the thermodynamics of methane removal, the amount of, I mean, the reaction is obviously a much easier reaction than carbon dioxide removal. However, the sheer air mass you have to move just seems to me extraordinary. So I haven't looked at it. I mean, I know that various people have talked to me to some extent, so like in principle, about methane removal. I'm not clear how it happens. I'm also a little worried. I mean, if you're doing methane removal, I'm a little worried about how you decouple methane removal from various other aspects of tropospheric chemistry that you might want to preserve. But it's not something I'm a real expert on. If you could magically take out all the methane, that would be brilliant. But I think but it's not a complete solution. It would be a good fix for timing, and it would be quite prompt. You're quite right. But the amount of air you have to process in order to take out stuff that's present in parts, in sort of like low parts per million, it's a lot of air processing.
Yeah. And what do you think in terms of the moral hazard? It gets lumped into
the moral hazard. I think the moral hazard of that would probably be less, because no one would claim. I mean, you can't do all the job with methane removal, right?
That's right. In
principle, you can do all the job. I mean, I don't think you would be remotely well advised to, but you could get a forcing from stratospheric aerosols that was equivalent to the forcing from greenhouse gases. So in a sense there, you can see how the two things might be traded off. If you could get a methane removal system, then that would be that, and it worked, and it didn't mess up hydroxyl balances or anything like that, then I'd be fine with that, because I don't think anyone would think that the promptly solving the methane problem would not make the main problem go away. So I think the moral hazard would not be as pronounced.
So do you think politically it's possible? You know, it's a bit easier than carbon?
Politically, it's a bit easier, I think. I mean, but you know, it's been very hard. I mean, just like, you know, it was hard for the adaptation people to get around the table. It's been hard for the short-lived climate forces people to get around the table. If you had a compelling relative technological insight into how to do methane removal, I think at the moment reduced emissions of methane are obviously quite a big thing. But you know, they're operating at 25% of the issue, not 100%.
Thank you.
I'm muted. Robert Chris, followed by Rebecca, followed by Andrew, followed by Clive. Robert, the floor is yours.
Thank you.
Hi, Robert.
Hi. Nice to see you again after all these years. So you were very much around when I started off on this back in 2006 as well. So anyway, that's all history. Today, you've made a really interesting discussion. You've spiked an interesting discussion. I want to make 2 points. First is really just an observation. You talk about the issues of refreezing the Arctic and whether that's the geopolitics of that. One of the things that we all have to remember is that just like the knee bone and the thigh bone, everything is connected. So you could, of course, refreeze the Arctic by cooling the tropics. There's more than one way of skinning this cat. And if that's something you're familiar with, we might want to talk about that. But the main question I want to ask you is this. When you were talking about the Arctic, Oliver, you referred to the fact or your view that if you were going to meddle in the Arctic, it would have to be through state actors. Now, it is my supposition, which you may or may not agree with, that any form of globally significant solar radiation management of whatever form, whatever technology, is going to require engagement by state actors. I just can't see it being undertaken by private enterprise.
I agree.
So that being the case, the state actors need to be engaged. Now, my question is this. So far, this very active debate about solar radiation management is largely conducted by priests preaching to the choir. But almost nothing, as far as I can see, is percolating through to the politicians who eventually would be responsible for making the key decisions about whether to move this forward or not. And I'd be really interested in your views about how you think the political community, the decision makers in this, could be brought into the debate in a constructive manner.
Well, if I felt I had a really compelling answer to that, I think I'd probably have tried it. I mean, how you sort of like move an Overton window. Sometimes you get an opportunity, but other than that, it's very hard to say. I mean, one of the things is that the body which has the biggest sort of like investment in solar geoengineering is a small minority of climate researchers. They're not necessarily popular with their own peers in that world. And they absolutely, most of the people who know most about solar geoengineering absolutely do not wish to be seen as advocates for it. The most they will advocate for is more research. And without sort of like a strong voice saying we should be trying this with some sort of constituency, that's what will get politicians interested. But I don't know where you generate that voice, because it's not something that you can build an entire political movement around. And for reasons that I'm sure we're all aware of, but we could take around the park again. There are real difficulties with people who come to this from environmentalist mindset, getting their heads around the idea of solar geoengineering. So, you know, things that happen tend not to have happened for a reason. And that, I think those are the reasons. There's something between an opportunity and a teachable moment, though, or possibly. If we do see, as Jim Hansen is talking about, and as you would to some extent expect from quasi-first principles, if we do see a significant change in rate of warming as a result of the removal of sulfur from bunker fuels in ships on the high seas, that sort of like, as you might say, termination shock might begin to, in an odd way, take us back to the one bit of Paul Crutzen's 2006 article that people tend to forget, which was that he was suggesting there's a trade-off between stratospheric and tropospheric sulfur. And so if we do see a significant increment in warming as a result of the removal of sulfur from bunker fuels, that might be the sort of thing that at least gets you into the UNFCCC. My own favorite move would be for a small number of nations, because I think it would only take 10 to convene a conference of the parties of the ENMOD treaty, which Article 3 of which would be a very good basis for moves on a geoengineering protocol. But that still requires 10 countries, and I don't think there are 10 countries at the moment willing to do that.
So if I just follow up on that, if I take what you're saying at face value, what we should do, those of us that are proselytizing for some kind of calling, is we should sit on our hands until the situation climatically becomes so severe that we are welcomed with open arms by the political community who are desperate to do something, because they realize.
I think to do so would be, I mean, I don't think there's any reason to think that the suggestion of solar geoengineering will be any more welcome in 2027 if people go quiet on it in the intervening years. I think that's both, I don't see any political advantage of that, and I see a certain amount of moral problem with it. Waiting, I mean, as those of us who had the misfortune to be dealing with Trotskyites in the 1980s know, just waiting for the contradictions in the system to become unsupportable is just, it's not neither a moral nor a practical strategy.
Okay, I'm gonna before I turn it over to Rebecca, just to sort of put you on the spot for a minute. Are you able and or willing in a public forum, since this is being recorded, to identify any potential political leader or key advisor to a political leader or head of a major institution that you have come across that is at the very least open to this, if not a strong advocate that we and others may be able to engage with?
Frankly, in what I've been doing recently, I haven't been looking, and those aren't the circles I move in. So I've never seen any statement from anyone that would suggest that would be the case. If I was looking, I might look in Canada. I might conceivably look in France. I might look in Singapore, but that's just sort of like finger in the air speculation.
Okay, well, we hope if you do come across someone, you'll get back to us. Because just to reiterate, I mean, we have 4 initials or words in our name, and one of them is action. I mean, that's our primary focus is discussion with the goal of leading to, real, measurable and impactful action. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca.
Hi, Oliver. I'm from Australia and I'm an economist, just as a short intro. Hello. If you're ever down this way, we'll show you Sydney Harbour, etc.
Thank you.
So my question actually relates to the time when you were speaking, when you got interrupted by a bit of a noise from exterior about marine cloud brightening compared with SRM, or SAI, I'm sorry. And what I'm interested in is your assessment, and whether that's on technical grounds, for example, climate forcing or cloud dynamics or logistics, or whether it's more to do with social license. And I'd like to just give you some background info that, as you can tell, I've been doing a lot of work on MCB recently, trying to understand it and write it up ready for a funding proposal. And I've also been doing some focus groups here with Indigenous people in Australia, and so far my sample size is 4, which is not huge, but it's been in-depth conversations. And I know that one of them is a climate activist and does not support SAI in any way, shape or form. Now, whether we think that is rational doesn't really matter. What matters is what she thinks and where she's coming from, and her own assessment of the science and the climate impacts and things, or the ecological and spiritual impacts. But also I know that Brian von Herzen from the Climate Foundation is advocating MCB as a first step because of the appealing nature of it in terms of sorry, I've just been interrupted by Aria's comment there. The nature of it in terms of spiritual and ecological saleability among all people of the world, Western, non-Western, etc. That's in summary why I think the Climate Foundation is advocating MCB. So I'm really interested in your technical assessment of MCB, but I wanted you to have the other info there about what I've been doing.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. That's really interesting. And yes, there will be people whose worldview does not accept this possibility. I remember being quite interested when I was talking to people from New Zealand about the possibility of de-extinction, since New Zealand has quite a lot of quite interesting, quite recently extinct megafauna, as indeed does Australia, and the degree to which the level of interest that I had slightly anticipated was just not culturally what was going to happen, certainly among that group of people. So on MCB, I think MCB has real promise. And one of the things I find very frustrating is that although there's been interest in marine cloud brightening and actually some money from it in Silicon Valley, no one's ever actually tried to put a bloody aerosol misty thing of the sort that people have been talking about into real operation. I know there's been some misting over some of the coral reefs, but it's not the sort of things that John Latham and Steve Salter were originally talking about. And I would love to find out whether you can actually do that, because I think it would be a really helpful thing to know. I think the MCB is way more sellable in some ways than stratospheric aerosol injection, because it can be done within a specific region and under a specific and recognized authority. So, for example, if the state of California came up with a good plan for MCB to increase the amount of mist getting into the coastal redwood forests, if those forests were in difficulty due to a lack of mist, I could see that being much more plausible than a global SAI program. The problem with MCB is that certainly in the sort of like classic Twomey Latham sort of formulation, you can't do it everywhere. You have to already have stratiform clouds that you can make brighter and longer lived. And if you don't have those, you're in a bit of trouble. And my impression is that those cloud banks don't typically exist over coral reefs. That's not a reason not to see if you can do something with whatever water is in the atmosphere over coral reefs, but it's certainly not the sort of situation. I mean, the classic sort of situation you'll be looking at for if you wanted to just get, you know, sort of like an average radiative forcing that's significant at a global scale. You want to be doing it on, you know, off Chile, off Namibia, off California. Those are where you have the really big banks of the sort of like uniform cloud layers that can really do this. But to some extent, I think that debate has been overtaken, because as a way of providing global cooling, I think that MCB has always been problematic, because to get a global effect from MCB, you have to really cool about 5% of the Earth's surface, and then hope that the weather will move that cooling around to places that you care about. So you're actively trying to disturb the weather systems, not just the climate, in order to move your cooling around. And I find that an implausible global plan of action. But as I say, I think at a regional to national level, the fact that you could do it in your own exclusive economic zone definitely means that it's something that nations could experiment with. I'm a little disappointed that people haven't done more of it from that point of view.
So, Oliver, just on that one, hooray, Stephen's raising his hand. Stephen has answered most
Hey,
of
Stephen.
Hi. We don't want to turn this into a forum digging into the technical side of MCB, but Stephen, in the work he's done, along with Cambridge and, you know, other people as well are working on it, has answered some of what you've said about do there need to be clouds there or not. And like maybe we could have it regionally in those three places that you mentioned, but I'm saying there's a lot more to it than meets the eye. And we are hoping, inverted commas, to find some funding to get the first, I mean, we're still in the scoping stages, but a few people here on this call have been working actively with Stephen, and with also, there was a conference in Cambridge recently about it. So I'm just basically saying maybe the Economist can do an article on it when we're ready.
Sure. I mean, I'm aware, for instance, Danny Rosenfeld is very keen on ideas, on some of these ideas, and, you know, has clearly forgotten far more about ocean aerosols than I will ever know. So there may be things to be done, but if you're trying to get a global effect, working on small places and looking for non-linearities strikes me as being a less appealing overall, less elegant's the wrong word. Yeah, it feels to me that going for big effects in some places that sort of like filter out, and I'm aware of some of Stephen's work on this, not all of it, is a slightly disturbing thing. I mean, we should think about the fact that, you know, the idea of teleconnected regional geoengineering, there's a recent paper, not that recent, a couple of years ago, by Kate Rickey. If you're changing the climate in one place with and working on the basis that there's a teleconnection to somewhere else, then already you're getting beyond that area where MCB might be seen as a local response to a local issue, such as coastal aridification or the loss of coral reefs.
Yes, well, basically, thanks very much, Oliver. That's lovely.
Yeah, Rebecca, thanks. I'm going to turn it over to Andrew, but I would like to say that, Stephen, if you would like to say something, I'm going to make sure that we have some time saved for you before the end. It's up to you. You're not on the spot. But since your method and you've been talked about for the past 10 minutes, please feel free to respond at the right time. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Andrew.
Hi, Oliver. I know you didn't use the word. I'm okay, thank you. I know you didn't use the words boiling frog, but you described a situation which is perhaps not dissimilar, where the debate hasn't really moved on, and you're not the first person in the field to commentate that the debate hasn't moved on in the past decade or so. The original ideas have just been refined as opposed to enacted or revolutionarily changed. And in that situation, when we were all waiting for this kind of global governance ideal to arise, who or what do you think will just get on with it and do it? And I'm not talking about, you know, make sunsets trivial little subscription thing. I'm more talking about, you know, could you imagine a billionaire or a coalition of small countries or Bangladesh or something like that just getting on it and breaking the deadlock and just cracking on? Because to me, that the frog is pretty well cooked, and I think if much was going to happen, it would probably have happened by now. And so
it's very interesting, the frog analogy. Jim Fallows, the great American journalist Jim Fallows, has had a long campaign to try and get rid of this metaphor because it ain't true. Because, you know, frogs aren't in fact stupid. It's possible that the analogy arises actually from frogs that had their brains pinned by scientists in the 19th century may have behaved like this, but most frogs will get out of hot water. The fact that it's not true doesn't make people stop using it, because it's so obvious that we need a metaphor like that. And the fact that frogs aren't willing to play ball with that particular metaphor doesn't sort of like retire it from language. I mean, you asked if I could imagine it. I mean, I did imagine it in the last chapter of Planet Remade. Yes, a small I think that at the very least for such a coalition, you need some existentially threatened countries, so probably small island states, to give you to sort of like move towards the notion of a moral license to operate. You probably need some tech and some capital, and you know there are a lot of a disturbing number of super empowered individuals around. But I think you also absolutely need, if not officially, clearly, tacitly, approval from at least one great power. I think that otherwise you really are a bit screwed. So I have no idea whether anyone would actually do that, and I certainly can't sort of like point to anyone. I mean, there's no evidence that any of the current crop of there must be a word for hectobillionaires, decibillionaires and hectobillionaires. I don't know of any of them that really have any interest in this, but you absolutely would need to get anywhere with such a let's just try it, and better to ask forgiveness than to ask permission. For that strategy to work at all, you absolutely need both the tacit approval of a large country and a small and very threatened country to be on board with it.
Okay. Could I just draw you on the tacit approval? I mean, I just want to ask, is tacit approval just ignoring it?
It's a bit more than that. It would be a sort of it's a sort of thing that would be communicated through tier 2, tier 3 international contacts, that sort of thing. It would be abstaining, or it would get as far as maybe vetoing a Security Council resolution. It would not be to say this is something we approve of, but it would be to let it be known that anyone trying to shut it down by force might find themselves in a deeper conflict. I mean, how that would be done, I don't know. I mean, the world is full of things where people were full of examples of what's sometimes called strategic opacity, where you don't make it entirely clear where you stand, but you give people the impression that they probably don't want to find out exactly where you stand. And if you think that sounds terrifying, I quite agree with you. And that's one of the reasons why I take the geopolitical threats from solar geoengineering very seriously, and I worry about them more than the biogeochemical and biogeophysical threats.
Okay, Clive?
Hi, Oliver. Thanks for joining us. I've been a subscriber to The Economist for many years, decades, and I read your book. Yeah, welcome. It's a good read. Don't have time to read it all, and I got your book and at least skimmed it, I would say, and thank you. I remember the thing about the who's we, and also it was very helpful that you talked about email groups of people talking about climate solutions, because at the time I didn't really know very many people. I was looking for I could see I was involved in climate lobbying for carbon pricing at the time, and could see it wasn't really going to go anywhere. So that's when I started to think about, well, what else could be done technically. So that's what led me to be connected to all these people here. So that was very helpful. So I've ended up working closely with a guy called Franz Ost. You might know, he's the pioneer of iron salt aerosol, which is methane removal, and other things. One thing there's a couple of things he's worried about with, so I'm trying to think if I've got a question in this. So sorry, a lot of this is not really questions. Two things he's worried about with SAI. He says that pretty much any surface in the stratosphere is a catalyst for ozone depletion, and so putting whether it's sulfate or carbonate up there is going to reduce the amount of ozone. The other thing he says he's even more worried about is well, if it reduces ozone, you get more UV, but if you get less UV, I mean, most of the sort of control of the climate does seem to be done in the troposphere, apart from, of course, the occasional volcano. So there's a great deal of oxidative capacity. There's a great deal of oxidation reactions that happen in the troposphere that remove methane, and they age the soot particles and other things. And of course, the ocean, in the cold periods, there was a lot of iron-rich dust that blew thousands of miles and landed in the ocean, and seems as though it would have fertilized large areas of ocean, a little bit diffusely, but increased the amount of phytoplankton. Of course, there was far more whales and other animals mixing and fertilizing the ocean then as well. And we know that phytoplankton produce dimethyl sulfide, which oxidizes, and this is one of the main nucleation, cloud condensation nuclei for marine clouds. And of course, marine clouds all over a huge area of ocean do provide a big cooling effect. So we're rather more keen on tropospheric cooling in this way, to try and as closely as possible mimic nature. So I suppose I should try and ask a question. Do you have an opinion? What do you think about some kind of? Because let me say one more thing. We've kind of got aerosol version 2. We've benefited enormously from Stephen Salter's help with his calculations on marine cloud brightening and calculating the cooling effect of clouds. We have another aerosol that can make very small particles, the right kind of size, really quite easily, which then sort of degenerate into clay. In the end, they just flocculate and become clay after they rain out. And they also deplete methane and do all this nucleic clouds and deplete methane and enhance the oxidative capacity of the troposphere. And they could include iron.
Clive, I'm sorry. Can you ask your question? It's just because.
So here's my question: what do you think are the chances of being allowed to have a diffuse fertilization of iron in the ocean over large areas of barren ocean? Sorry.
Problem is that barren ocean is harder. I mean, there's a procedure, right? The London Convention tells you about how you could do that. And so that's, I mean, it's not something, but it will be very hard to. I think you'd find it much easier to do in the EEZ of a small island nation. I can't see any reason why that would be difficult other than finding a small island nation that wanted to do it. If you're going, I mean, I think doing it, I think many people have told me, and I can't speak to this with any direct authority. I'm not a lawyer and I'm not close to negotiations. A lot of people seem to think that the constraints on research of that sort in the London Protocol are pretty restrictive. And it would be hard, and it would be a difficult experiment to do. You would need a lot of stuff and a lot of monitoring, and so you're talking about someone who's willing to put tens of millions of dollars into any sort of experiment like that, I'd have thought. And I think that if you could find someone who could do it, you might well be able to find a place you could do it, but I wouldn't necessarily bet on it.
Okay,
thank you very much. Thank you,
Jonathan. Floor is yours.
Hey there. Well, I've read most of the first 54 pages of your book, and I ordered the hard copy. And I really find your writing style delightful.
Thank you.
You're using philosophy and figurative imagery to make the science, enjoyable. So first of all, I want to encourage you to write another book, at least one, right away. And but I wanted to ask, with your economics background, have you given any musing or thoughts to how we can monetize the activity, how we can make people want to invest, and how we can reward people for doing cooling, just generally cooling?
Well, I mean, for cooling through greenhouse gas removal, I can see how you could do it with some sort of market mechanism. I'm not sure that's the way that I would necessarily want to see it done, but that is a way that you could absolutely do it if you have the right, and the ability to quantify biomass quite precisely remotely has been growing very quickly over the last few years. So the idea that could be done, that could be monetized. I think monetizing radiative forcing, there have been suggestions of sort of like selling radiative forcing as a service, but I find that very hard to do, and I don't particularly want. I think that while a profit motive, and Andrew mentioned the unfortunate people of making sense of, while a profit motive may get you some of the way, and it might possibly bring out some ideas at some point. The political risks in a technology like this really do, to me, depend on the idea of state action. I can see how you can marketize, I'm not sure it's the best idea, but I see how you can marketize carbon dioxide reduction. Marketizing the reduction of sunlight, I think, is really, really difficult. Not least because you don't see, there aren't huge liability issues for the for carbon dioxide reduction, but I can see that you could get hit by liability issues in quite a big way, and you would not, and the degree of legal jurisdictional risk would be very high. So I don't think it's a likely idea, and I don't think it's a good idea, basically.
Okay, well, that seems pretty definitive. Before I turn it over to Robert Tulip, I wanted to ask you to sort of put your communications media hat on, if you will, in addition to all the other hats occupying your head, and sort of have two related questions. One is, we have had, and probably other groups as well, these continuing discussions about terminology, both in terms of their scientific accuracy and their ability to be clear and influence people. And as you picked up in reading some of our materials, I mean, some of the terms we've come up with are things like direct climate cooling rather than SRM, for example, the climate triad as an approach that brings the three together, the goal of getting to well below 1 degree, because it's the same construction as well below 2, except you just substitute 1 for 2, and the term, which is controversial among some people, of climate restoration. So that's sort of one basket of questions, whether you have any reaction to those terms, either technically or in their ability to be effective ways to communicate. And related to that is, if you were sort of our consultant and we had a little bit of a retreat, and not knowing obviously any more than you know about us right at this minute, what kind of advice would you give us, very tangible advice on how we can get articles in the media? Someone asked that earlier today. I think the question then went, the response went elsewhere. We've tried to some degree, but not in any kind of systematic way so far. And we recognize, presumably, that we need to, like every other group. So that's sort of a two-part question, if you will.
Okay. Well, the first part, I think that this area doesn't need new terminology. I get pretty tired of being told by Kelly Wanzer that I should be talking about climate intervention when I'm talking about solar geoengineering. I've had enough of a background in British nuclear debates to know that changing the name of something doesn't really help you very much. And in fact, in some ways, it sort of like just re-stigmatizes the term that you're changing away from. So people say they want to call it climate intervention, but it's really solar geoengineering or geoengineering. I think you should try and make, I think trying to, I mean, it can work, the Republican move towards climate change. People say it worked. I'm not sure. I was in the field at the time. I'm not sure how much it worked. I know that you could spend a huge amount of money on consultants telling you it would work. But I'm not, so I don't think we need a new term like direct climate cooling. I do quite like the idea of the triad. It's sort of like the positive side of what's often called a trilemma, one of those things where you can have any two but not three. You can't have faster, cheaper, better. You can't have secure, cheap, and safe, secure, cheap, and clean when it comes to energy, that sort of thing. And so as I understand the climate triad, you're saying it's something where you have to have all three legs. And I think that's a useful idea. That's something that I liked in your literature. On the question of placing articles, I'm really not sure, because it's something which, for reasons of professional pride and courtesy, we tend not to want to do. I mean, journalists sell articles. I've never worked as an op-ed editor, and so I've no idea how that side of the world really works, except that I've occasionally sold op-eds, and I did that by going to the editor, to a relevant op-ed editor. Obviously at The Economist, I just pictured at an editorial meeting. And I go to an op-ed editor and I say, I'd like to write about this. And sometimes they say yes, and sometimes they say no. But they know me as a writer. I've no idea how you get standing to do something like that. from a sort of like activist point of view. I would think you either cultivate or you piggyback on someone who already has the connections. So, you know, if, for instance, you're a former British cabinet scientific advisor, you might find an easier way into this sort of world than the average civilian would.
Okay. Well, thanks. Really appreciate that, frank and direct response to my questions. I'm going to ask Stephen Penningroth to ask a question. I also want to just check with you, Stephen Salter. Do you want a couple minutes? No commitment. After Stephen speaks.
I'm not muted. Can you hear me?
Yes.
The first thing is about Oliver saying that you can only do.
Well, all I'm asking now is if you want a little time.
Herb, seeing as Stephen is a scientific contributor, pretty please could we have him first, because there's only 8 minutes left, and it's really hard to get to the bottom of the science.
Okay. Yes, that's fine with me.
All right, then go ahead, Stephen Salter. Good.
All right. First of all, Oliver said that you can only do marine cloud brightening where there are clouds. Do you remember the thing called the beast from the east? Wind is an amazingly efficient way of moving temperature along down the wind direction. So all you really need to do is to rely on the wind and maybe the currents to move the heat into another place.
Look, I quite agree with that, Stephen. But as I say, then you're actively trying to not to change specific parts of the weather system. Which I think takes you into a different level of compare. Of course, yes, you can advect temperature change around the place. I quite agree with that. But you have to realize. But if you want to take a forcing that you're doing in, you know, on 10% of the world's surface and move it all around the world, you need to actually change weather patterns a lot. And I think that's I think that's beyond that. In some ways concerns me more than the approximation to changing the solar constant that you get with stratospheric aerosols. And it is only an approximation, and that, of course, removes a lot of chemistry and a lot of dynamics, but
right.
It is an approximation.
The second thing is a way to get it sold. And I think what you do is you get a bunch of governments around the Gulf of Mexico, let's say, to say that they would like to see the patterns of sea surface temperatures in the Atlantic and the Caribbean to be different from what they are now and more like what they used to be when hurricanes weren't quite so bad. If you did this after a particularly bad hurricane season, I think you'd find very little objection to it, and you'd pay the spray contractors according to how close they would get to the sea surface temperatures that the governments around that area ask them to be. And
how would you? I mean, but if you're thinking about reproducing the sort of like low hurricane sea surface temperature distribution of the 1980s, say, what are you going to do about the drought in the Sahel that you're also causing?
I think I'd just stick to trying to locate it in the places we know where it's going to affect hurricanes. At the moment, the evidence...
But the argument is pretty strong, Stephen, that it was the aerosol cooling of the Mid-Atlantic that was associated with sulfates in the 1980s that both dampened the hurricane season for the best part of 10 years and also caused droughts in the Sahel. I'm not sure that you can necessarily disentangle those two effects. And certainly, if you cool the surface of the ocean and there's a drought in the Sahel, even if there is no causative mechanism, the fact of that memory from climatology's past, I think, would be extremely problematic to you.
Well, I would look at the work that was done by the Norwegians, who showed that if we just did an increase of 50% of the condensation nuclei in regions where there was low cloud, this did help the drought-stricken regions in the Sahara and in Australia and all over the place. It was really very benign. It's work by Stern, I think it's 2018.
I think that's very interesting. And, you know, as I say, I have no problem with marine cloud brightening, and I wish someone would actually build some kit that would show us the way, how and to what extent it would actually work. And the fact that sort of like, what, 14 years after we first met in Edinburgh, we still don't have that proof of principle. Is something that I find, I'm sure I don't find it as distressing as you do, Stephen, but I do find it distressing.
Well, the engineering is nearly complete. I can show people all the detailed dimension tolerance drawings, and we could start making bits really tomorrow.
All right. Well, on that positive note, I know you have to head off, Oliver, and so sorry we won't have time for any more questions. I really just want to thank you so deeply and profoundly. It was so stimulating and so knowledgeable as I expected, or it even exceeded my expectations. We hope you'll stay in touch with us. We know you have a day job and books to read and write and conferences to go over the world, but we're an action group, and if we can count on at least some advisory support or assistance, that would be great.
Of course. Ask me questions. And Robert and Stephen Penninggrove, if you want to email me your questions, I'll get to them by email tomorrow, okay?
Okay, thank you very much.
What's your email address?
That's very generous.
Oliver Morton at economist.com. Oliver Morton, all one word.
Thank you, Oliver.
Simple to remember. Thanks, everybody. The steering circle.
Thanks for the invitation. It was nice talking to you all. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks again, Oliver.